was late in the evening when the quiet streets of Crestwood seemed almost too peaceful, the kind of peace that made everything feel still, like time itself had slowed down. Most people were already indoors, either settling into their favorite TV shows or getting ready for bed, but not everyone was asleep yet. Out on the dark roads, two men were about to have an encounter that would change both their lives forever. Officer Gary Miller sat in his patrol car, sipping coffee from a thermos. He wasn't particularly fond of night shifts, but they came with the job. Gary liked to think of himself as someone who kept order in the world. He believed strongly in rules and discipline, though sometimes his beliefs crossed over into harsh judgments about others. Tonight, however, he didn't expect anything unusual, just another routine drive through the neighborhood to make sure everything stayed quiet. As he turned onto Maple Street, his headlights caught something, a car ahead with what looked like a broken taillight. It wasn't blinking properly, just glowing faintly. To Gary, this was enough reason to pull the vehicle over. Rules were rules, after all. He flicked on his sirens and followed the sedan until it pulled over to the side of the road. The driver stepped out slowly, keeping his hands visible. His name was Marcus Johnson, though Gary didn't know that yet. Marcus was a tall, broad-shouldered man with short-cropped hair and a calm expression. He wore a plain jacket and jeans, nothing flashy or out of place. As he stood beside his car, he glanced at the officer approaching him, trying to gauge the situation without showing any sign of fear. Gary walked up to Marcus with his usual air of authority. His hand rested lightly on the grip of his holstered gun, a habit born out of years on the force. "License and registration," he said sharply, his tone leaving no room for argument. Marcus nodded politely, reaching into his pocket for his wallet. "Yes, sir," he replied calmly, making sure his movements were slow and deliberate so as not to provoke suspicion. He handed over his documents, watching as Gary examined them under the glow of his flashlight. For a moment, everything seemed normal, but then Gary's eyes narrowed as he studied the ID. Something about Marcus rubbed him the wrong way, though he couldn't quite put his finger on it. Maybe it was the way Marcus carried himself. Too confident, too relaxed. Or maybe it was just Gary's own biases creeping in again, whispering things he shouldn't listen to but did anyway. "You live around here?" Gary asked, his voice colder now. "No, sir," Marcus answered truthfully. "I'm visiting family." Gary frowned. "Visiting family? At this hour?" Marcus shrugged slightly, careful not to appear defensive. "They work late hours. I figured I'd stop by after my meeting." "What kind of meeting?" Gary pressed, taking a step closer. Marcus hesitated briefly before answering. "Business-related. Nothing illegal, if that's what you're asking." Gary bristled at the comment. Who did this guy think he was, talking back like that? Without thinking, he reached for his gun and pointed it at Marcus. "Don't get smart with me," he snapped. "Just answer the questions." Marcus raised his hands higher, palms open. "I'm sorry, officer. I didn't mean any disrespect." His voice remained steady despite the sudden escalation. Inside, though, his mind raced. This wasn't how traffic stops usually went, even for him. He knew better than most how quickly situations could spiral out of control. Time seemed to stretch as the two men faced each other. Gary's finger hovered near the trigger, his grip tightening unconsciously. He told himself he was just being cautious, doing his duty to protect the public, but deep down he knew there was more to it than that. Years of prejudice and preconceived notions clouded his judgment, making him see threats where none existed. Suddenly a sound broke the tension. A phone rang loudly from inside Marcus's jacket pocket. Both men froze, startled by the noise. Gary's eyes darted toward the source, his heart pounding faster. "Don't move," he barked, his voice cracking slightly. Marcus hesitated, unsure whether moving would worsen the situation. But the ringing continued, persistent and impossible to ignore. Slowly, deliberately, he reached into his pocket and pulled out the phone. The screen lit up brightly against the darkness, displaying a caller ID that stopped him cold. The Pentagon. Gary saw it too. For a split second, confusion replaced anger on his face. What was going on? Why was the Pentagon calling this man? Before he could demand answers, Marcus pressed the button to answer the call and put it on speakerphone. A crisp, commanding voice filled the air. "Mr. Johnson, we need your confirmation code immediately." Marcus exhaled slowly, relief washing over him. "Colonel Hayes," he said, addressing the caller directly. "I'm currently detained by local law enforcement. Can you verify my clearance level?" There was a brief pause on the other end. Then the voice responded, firm and authoritative. "Confirmed. Eclipse protocol active. Stand by for extraction." Gary stared at Marcus, his mind reeling. Who was this man? And why was the Pentagon involved? All the aggression drained out of him, replaced by sheer bewilderment. Whatever he had expected when he pulled over this car, it certainly wasn't this. Marcus ended the call and turned to Gary, his expression unreadable. "Officer," he said quietly, "you've got two options. Let me go now, or deal with the consequences of interfering with national security." Gary opened his mouth to respond but found no words. For once in his life, he was completely speechless. This concludes Part 1. Let me know if you'd like me to proceed with generating additional parts. The silence was deafening. Gary stood there, his gun still half raised, staring at Marcus like he had just seen a ghost. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Who was this man? Why was the Pentagon calling him? And what did Eclipse Protocol even mean? None of it added up, and Gary felt completely out of his depth. Marcus didn't wait for Gary to recover. He slipped his phone back into his pocket and straightened up, his posture relaxed but alert. There was no fear in his eyes now, only patience, as if he'd been through this kind of situation before and knew exactly how it would play out. "Officer," Marcus repeated calmly, "you need to decide quickly. This isn't just about me anymore." Gary blinked, struggling to find words. What do you mean?" he stammered, his voice unsteady. Marcus sighed softly, almost sympathetically. "Look, I don't want any trouble. But the people I work with, they take security very seriously. If they think you're obstructing my mission, they won't hesitate to act. Trust me, you don't want that kind of attention." Before Gary could respond, the sound of screeching tires broke the tension. Both men turned toward the noise as 3 black SUVs came speeding down the road, their headlights cutting through the darkness like spotlights. They skidded to a halt behind Gary's patrol car, surrounding the scene in seconds. Doors opened and armed agents poured out, moving with precision and purpose. Gary instinctively stepped back, his grip tightening on his weapon again. His training kicked in, telling him to stay vigilant. But something told him these weren't ordinary criminals. These were professionals, men and women who looked like they belonged in a movie about secret operations. Their tactical gear, sunglasses despite the nighttime setting, and earpieces all screamed authority. One of them stepped forward, a tall, broad-shouldered man with short-cropped hair and a no-nonsense expression. His name tag read, Cole, and his presence alone commanded respect. Ignoring Gary completely, Agent Cole approached Marcus, scanning him quickly for signs of injury. When he saw none, he gave a curt nod. "Mr. Johnson, are you secure?" Marcus nodded once. "Yes, Agent Cole. No harm done." Agent Cole turned, to face Gary then, his sharp gaze pinning the officer in place. "Sir," he said, his tone clipped and formal, "we'll need your full cooperation moving forward. Please lower your weapon and step aside." Gary hesitated, torn between his instincts as a cop and the overwhelming realization that he was dealing with something far beyond his understanding. His pride warred with his fear, leaving him paralyzed. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he slowly lowered his gun and took a step back. "Who is this guy?" Gary asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Agent Cole didn't answer directly. Instead, he signaled to one of his team members who handed Gary a thick folder marked, "Classified." "You'll find everything you need to know in there," Cole said briskly. "For now, stand down and let us handle the situation." Gary stared at the folder in his hands, unsure whether to open it or not. Meanwhile, the agents surrounded Marcus, escorting him toward one of the SUVs. One of them held the door open while another checked the area for potential threats. It was clear they weren't taking any chances. As Marcus climbed into the vehicle, he glanced back at Gary one last time. There was no anger in his expression, only a quiet understanding. "Take care of yourself, officer," he said simply before disappearing inside. The convoy moved swiftly, leaving Gary standing alone on the side of the road. The flashing lights of his patrol car were the only illumination now, casting long shadows across the pavement. He watched the taillights of the SUVs fade into the distance, feeling more confused and unsettled than ever before. Back at the station, later that night, Gary sat at his desk, staring blankly at the classified folder in front of him. He hadn't opened it yet. Part of him wasn't sure he wanted to. Whatever secrets lay inside, he knew they would change the way he viewed the world, and himself. His partner, Steve, walked over and noticed the folder. "What's that?" he asked casually, plopping down in the chair next to Gary. Gary hesitated, unsure how much to share. "It's complicated," he muttered finally. Steve raised an eyebrow. "Complicated how? You look like you've seen a ghost." Gary shook his head, rubbing his temples. "I don't even know where to start." "Well, try," Steve urged. "You're freaking me out here." Sighing deeply, Gary recounted the events of the evening, the traffic stop, the mysterious phone call, the arrival of the agents, and Marcus's cryptic warning. As he spoke, Steve's expression shifted from curiosity to disbelief. "You're kidding, right?" Steve said when Gary finished. "The Pentagon? Secret missions? Extracting? Some guy in the middle of nowhere? Sounds like a bad action movie." "I wish I were kidding," Gary replied grimly. "But it really happened, and these guys..." He gestured vaguely toward the folder. "They weren't messing around." Steve leaned back in his chair, shaking his head. "Man, you've got yourself into something big. What are you going to do now?" Gary didn't have an answer. For the first time in his career, he felt completely powerless. Normally, he prided himself on being in control, on knowing exactly what to do in any given situation. But tonight, he had been reduced to a bystander, watching as forces far greater than him took over. Eventually, curiosity got the better of him, and he opened the folder. Inside were documents detailing Marcus's involvement with the Department of Defense. According to the papers, Marcus was a cybersecurity expert who worked undercover to monitor potential threats from foreign entities. His role was classified, and anyone interfering with his work could face severe legal consequences. Reading through the information, Gary felt a mix of emotions: shock, guilt, and a growing sense of shame. How could he have misjudged Marcus so badly? All those years of prejudice and bias had clouded his judgment, leading him to assume the worst about a man who was actually doing important work for the country. By the time he closed the folder, dawn was breaking outside. The sky was painted in shades of orange and pink, signaling the start of a new day. But for Gary, it felt like the beginning of a long journey, one of self-reflection and accountability. He knew he couldn't undo what had happened, but maybe he could learn from it. Maybe he could use this experience to become a better version of himself, not just as a police officer, but as a human being. With that thought in mind, Gary stood up, grabbed the folder, and headed home. He needed to talk to Anna, his wife. She always had a way of grounding him, of helping him see things clearly when his own perspective failed him. If anyone could help him navigate this mess, it was her. Little did Gary know this was only the beginning. The encounter with Marcus had opened his eyes to a world he never knew existed, a world of secrets, danger, and moral complexities. And, while he might never fully understand it, he was determined to ensure that it changed him for the better. Gary sat stiffly on the edge of the couch, his elbows resting on his knees. The classified folder lay open on the coffee table in front of him, its pages spread out like pieces of a puzzle he couldn't quite put together. He stared at the words, without really seeing them, his mind replaying the events of the previous night over and over again. Anna watched him quietly from her armchair across the room. She had always been good at reading people, especially Gary. Something was clearly bothering him, more than usual, and she could tell it wasn't just another rough day at work. When he finally looked up at her, his eyes were clouded with confusion and guilt. "You need to tell me what happened," Anna said gently, leaning forward slightly. Her tone was calm but firm, the same one she used when their kids needed guidance or reassurance. "Whatever it is, I'm here." Gary sighed deeply, running a hand through his graying hair. "It's complicated," he began, his voice hesitant. "I pulled someone over last night. A routine traffic stop, or so I thought." Anna nodded encouragingly, waiting for him to continue. "At first it seemed normal," Gary went on, his words coming slowly, as if he were piecing together fragments of memory. "But then things got strange. Really strange." He paused, unsure how to explain what had unfolded. How could he describe something that sounded like it belonged in a spy movie? Yet every detail was burned into his mind, vivid and undeniable. "The guy I stopped, Marcus, he wasn't who I thought he was," Gary admitted, his voice dropping lower. "When I called him out for a broken taillight, I assumed he was just some ordinary driver. But then his phone rang." Anna tilted her head slightly, intrigued. "And?" "It wasn't a regular call," Gary explained, his brow furrowing. "The caller ID said the Pentagon. And when Marcus answered it, everything changed." Anna blinked, surprised. "The Pentagon? Are you serious?" Gary nodded grimly. "Yeah. Some colonel, a woman, started talking about protocols and clearance levels. She called him by a code name, Eclipse, and said something about national security. Then these agents showed up in black SUVs, armed to the teeth, and took him away." Anna leaned back in her chair, processing what she'd heard. "So, what are you saying? This guy works for the government or something?" "Apparently," Gary replied, his voice tinged with frustration. "They gave me this folder after they left." He gestured toward the documents on the table. "Turns out Marcus is some kind of cybersecurity expert working undercover for the Department of Defense. They monitor threats from foreign entities or whatever. Classified stuff." Anna picked up the folder, flipping through the pages briefly, before setting it aside. "Okay, so why does this have you so rattled? Sounds like you stumbled into something bigger than expected, but isn't that a good thing?" "You didn't hurt anyone, right?" Gary shook his head, avoiding her gaze. "That's not the point. The point is, I judged him before I even knew who he was. I treated him like a criminal because of how he looked, because of my own biases." Anna studied him carefully, her expression softening. "Gary, we all make mistakes. What matters is what you do next." "I know," Gary muttered, rubbing his temples. "But it's not just about this one incident. It's about everything. All those years of assuming the worst about people based on their race or background. It's wrong, Anna. I see that now, and I don't know how to fix it." Anna reached across the table, placing a reassuring hand on his arm. "You start by acknowledging it, by admitting where you went wrong and committing to change. That's step one." Gary looked at her, searching her eyes for answers. "What if it's not enough? What if no one believes I've changed?" "That's not your concern," Anna replied firmly. "Your job is to focus on becoming better, not for others, but for yourself. If you truly mean it, people will notice eventually. Change takes time, Gary. Be patient." Her words hit home, resonating deep within him. For the first time since the encounter with Marcus, Gary felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe he couldn't undo the past, but he could shape his future. He could use this experience as a turning point, a chance to confront his prejudices and grow into a better version of himself. Over the next few days, Gary threw himself into learning more about racial bias and systemic issues within law enforcement. He attended workshops, read books, and listened to podcasts featuring voices from marginalized communities. At first, it was uncomfortable, painfully so, but he forced himself to keep going. Every story he heard, every statistic he learned, chipped away at the walls he had built around his worldview. At work, Gary tried to implement what he was learning. He became more mindful of his interactions with drivers during traffic stops, making a conscious effort to treat everyone fairly regardless of their appearance. Some of his colleagues noticed the shift in his behavior and teased him about being soft, but Gary ignored them. He knew they didn't understand, not yet anyway. One evening, while patrolling the streets of Crestwood, Gary spotted Marcus walking along the sidewalk. His heart skipped a beat. Part of him wanted to turn the other way to avoid any potential awkwardness, but another part, the part that had been working so hard to change, knew this was an opportunity he couldn't pass up. Pulling over to the curb, Gary stepped out of his patrol car and approached Marcus cautiously. "Mr. Johnson," he called. "Out," his voice steady despite the nerves bubbling inside him. Marcus turned, his expression neutral. "Officer Miller?" he acknowledged politely. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then Gary cleared his throat and said, "I owe you an apology for what happened the other night. I misjudged you and I'm sorry." Marcus studied him for a long moment, his dark eyes searching Gary's face. Finally, he nodded. "Apology accepted. Not everyone admits when they're wrong." Gary exhaled sharply, feeling a weight lift off his shoulders. "Thank you. I've been doing a lot of thinking since then, about my actions, about how I've treated people in the past. I want to do better." Marcus smiled faintly, a hint of approval in his expression. "That's a good start. Keep going." With that, Marcus continued down the street, leaving Gary standing there, watching him go. For the first time in a long time, Gary felt like he was on the right path. There was still much work to be done, both personally and professionally, but he believed real change was possible, if he stayed committed. As he climbed back into his patrol car, Gary glanced at the rearview mirror, catching a glimpse of his reflection. He didn't recognize the man staring back at him, not yet, but he hoped someday he would. The summons came unexpectedly, tucked inside an envelope marked Internal Review Board. Gary stared at it for a long time after opening it, his heart pounding in his chest. He had known this day might come, had even prepared himself for it. But, now that it was here, he couldn't shake the unease gnawing at him. Testifying before the board wasn't something he looked forward to, especially when the subject was so deeply personal, but avoiding it wasn't an option either. The morning of the hearing arrived too quickly. Gary dressed carefully, choosing a plain gray suit and tie to appear respectful and professional. As he drove to the government building where the review would take place, his mind raced with questions. Would they believe him? Could he explain himself well enough to make them understand how much he'd changed? Or would they see him as just another officer unwilling to admit his mistakes? When he walked into the room, the atmosphere was heavy with formality. 3 officials sat behind a long table, their expressions unreadable. 2 were men, one older with silver hair and glasses, the other younger with sharp features. Between them sat a woman who looked no nonsense, her pen poised over a notepad as if ready to jot down every word. Behind them, rows of empty chairs stretched out, making the space feel larger than it was. Gary took a seat at the witness stand, adjusting his tie nervously. One of the men introduced himself as Chairman Roberts and began explaining the purpose of the hearing to evaluate Gary's conduct during the traffic stop involving Marcus Johnson. Then, without further preamble, he asked the first question. "Officer Miller, can you describe the events leading up to your encounter with Mr. Johnson?" Gary cleared his throat, forcing himself to stay calm. "Yes, sir," he began, his voice steady despite the nerves twisting in his stomach. "It started as a routine traffic stop. I noticed a broken taillight on Mr. Johnson's car and pulled him over." "And what happened next?" Chairman Roberts prompted. "I approached his vehicle and requested identification," Gary continued. "At first, everything seemed normal, but then things escalated." He paused, searching for the right words. This was the part he dreaded most, the part where he had to admit his own failings. Taking a deep breath, he pressed on. "I made assumptions about Mr. Johnson based on appearances. My tone became aggressive, and I drew my weapon unnecessarily." That's when his phone rang. The room fell silent as Gary recounted the rest of the story. The mysterious call from the Pentagon, the arrival of the agents, and the classified folder detailing Marcus's role in national security. When he finished, Chairman Roberts leaned forward slightly, studying him intently. "Why did you react the way you did, Officer Miller?" he asked, his tone neutral but probing. Gary hesitated, knowing there was no point in sugarcoating the truth. "Because of bias," he admitted quietly. "I judged Mr. Johnson unfairly because of my own prejudices. I assumed the worst about him before I even knew who he was." There was a beat of silence as the panel absorbed his words. Finally, the woman spoke up. "And how do you feel about that now?" "I feel ashamed," Gary replied honestly, meeting her gaze. "But more than that, I feel motivated to change. Since that night, I've been educating myself about racial bias and systemic issues within law enforcement. I've attended workshops, read books, and tried to listen to perspectives I hadn't considered before. It's not easy. It's uncomfortable sometimes. But I know it's necessary." The younger man nodded thoughtfully. "What steps have you taken to ensure this doesn't happen again?" "I've made a conscious effort to treat everyone fairly, regardless of their appearance," Gary explained. "During traffic stops, I remind myself to approach each situation objectively. I've also started advocating for reforms within my department to address these kinds of biases systemically." Chairman Roberts exchanged glances with the others before turning back to Gary. "Thank you for your honesty, Officer Miller. We'll take your testimony into consideration as we deliberate." As Gary left the room, he felt drained but oddly relieved. For once, he hadn't shied away from accountability. Whether or not the board believed him, he had done the right thing by owning up to his mistakes, and that, he realized, was progress. In the weeks that followed, Gary threw himself into his work with renewed determination. His colleagues noticed the change in him, some with skepticism, others with cautious optimism. A few even joined him in attending diversity training sessions, inspired by his willingness to confront difficult truths. One afternoon, while patrolling near the edge of town, Gary spotted Marcus walking along the sidewalk again. This time, instead of hesitating, he pulled over immediately and stepped out of the car. Marcus saw him approaching and stopped, waiting patiently. "Mr. Johnson," Gary said, offering a small smile. "How are you doing?" Marcus raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by the friendly greeting. "I'm good, Officer Miller. How about you?" "Better than before," Gary admitted. "I wanted to thank you for giving me a chance to apologize. It meant a lot." Marcus nodded slowly, his expression softening. "It takes courage to admit when you're wrong. Not everyone does that." "Well, I'm trying," Gary replied earnestly. "I won't say I've got everything figured out. I still have a lot to learn, but I'm committed to doing better." "That's all anyone can ask for," Marcus said, extending his hand. "Keep going." Gary shook his hand firmly, feeling a sense of closure he hadn't expected. As he returned to his patrol car, he glanced back at Marcus, who waved briefly before continuing on his way. For the first time in years, Gary felt hopeful, not just about his career, but about the kind of person he could become. That evening, Gary sat at his kitchen table with Anna, sharing the details of his day. She listened intently, smiling when he told her about running into Marcus again. "See?" she said when he finished. "Change is possible. You're proving that every day." Gary smiled back, though there was still a hint of uncertainty in his eyes. "I hope so. There's still a long road ahead, but I'm ready to face it." Anna reached across the table, squeezing his hand. "We'll face it together." As they sat there, bathed in the warm glow of the kitchen light, Gary allowed himself a moment of quiet gratitude. He knew the journey wouldn't be easy, but he also knew he wasn't alone. With Anna by his side and a newfound sense of purpose guiding him, he was ready to keep moving forward, one step at a time. Months had passed since that fateful night on Maple Street, but its impact lingered in ways Gary never could have imagined. Every day brought new challenges and new opportunities to prove to himself and others that he was serious about change. Some days were harder than others, especially when old habits threatened to creep back in. But Gary reminded himself of the lessons he'd learned. Progress wasn't always linear, and small steps mattered just as much as big ones. The internal review board had issued their decision shortly after Gary's testimony. While they acknowledged his misconduct during the traffic stop, they also commended him for taking responsibility and committing to personal growth. Instead of disciplinary action, they recommended mandatory participation in ongoing diversity, training programs, and regular check-ins with a counselor specializing in bias awareness. To Gary, it felt like a second chance, a chance to rebuild not only his reputation but also his character. At work, Gary became an advocate for reform within the department. He started by organizing informal discussions among his colleagues, sharing insights from the workshops he attended and encouraging open conversations about racial bias. At first, some officers dismissed his efforts as unnecessary or overly idealistic. But over time, a few began to listen. One by one, they joined him in attending seminars and reading materials that challenged their assumptions. Slowly, the culture within the precinct began to shift, subtly perhaps, but noticeably. Gary's wife Anna played a crucial role in supporting him through this journey. She cheered his victories no matter how small, and offered guidance when he stumbled. On tough days, she reminded him why he'd chosen this path in the first place. "Change starts with you," she would say. "Don't lose sight of that." 1. Crisp autumn morning, Gary found himself patrolling the same stretch of road where everything had changed. The leaves on the trees lining the street had turned brilliant shades of orange and red, scattering across the pavement in the gentle breeze. As he drove slowly, keeping an eye out for any issues, he spotted Marcus walking along the sidewalk once again. This time, there was no hesitation. Gary pulled over smoothly and stepped out of the patrol car, smiling warmly as he approached Marcus. "Good morning, Mr. Johnson," he said, tipping his hat slightly. "How are things?" Marcus stopped and turned, a look of mild surprise crossing his face. Then he smiled faintly, recognizing the sincerity in Gary's tone. "Morning, officer. Miller, things are good. How about you?" "I'm doing well," Gary replied, his voice steady and genuine. "I wanted to thank you again for everything. You've inspired me to keep pushing forward." Marcus nodded thoughtfully, his expression softening. "That means a lot, coming from you. Not everyone would admit they were wrong, let alone work so hard to make amends." "It's not easy," Gary admitted, glancing down briefly before meeting Marcus's gaze. "But it's worth it. I've been learning a lot about myself and about the kind of person I want to be." "You're already making a difference," Marcus said, his tone reassuring. "Keep going. That's all anyone can ask for." They stood there for a moment, two men who might never have crossed paths under normal circumstances, united by an unexpected connection. Finally, Gary extended his hand. "Thank you, Mr. Johnson, for giving me a chance to grow." Marcus shook, his hand firmly holding his gaze. "You're welcome, Officer Miller, and remember, change doesn't happen overnight. Be patient with yourself." With that, Marcus continued on his way, disappearing around the corner. Gary watched him go, feeling a deep sense of gratitude. This encounter, like the previous ones, reinforced his belief that real change was possible, not just for him, but for everyone willing to put in the effort. As Gary climbed back into his patrol car, he took a moment to reflect on how far he'd come. Once consumed by pride and prejudice, he now embraced humility and self-awareness. It hadn't been an easy journey, and it certainly wasn't over. But each step forward filled him with hope for the future. Later that evening, Gary sat, at home with Anna, flipping through a photo album while sipping coffee. They came across pictures from years ago, family vacations, holiday gatherings, milestones celebrated together. Looking at those memories, Gary realized something important. Life was about more than just surviving. It was about growing, connecting, and leaving a positive mark on the world. "I'm proud of you," Anna said softly, resting her head on his shoulder. "You've come such a long way." "Thanks to you," Gary replied, wrapping an arm around her. "I couldn't have done it without your support." Anna smiled, her eyes twinkling. "We're in this together, remember?" Gary nodded, feeling a warmth spread through him. Together they turned the page, ready to create new memories built on love, understanding, and resilience. The next morning, Gary woke up early, eager to start his day. As he prepared for work, he glanced out the window, at the rising sun painting the sky in hues of gold and pink. It was a beautiful sight, one that reminded him of renewal and possibility. With a renewed sense of purpose, he headed out the door, ready to face whatever lay ahead. Driving through the streets of Crestwood, Gary noticed subtle signs of change. Neighbors greeted each other warmly, regardless of race or background. Community events drew diverse crowds, fostering connections and breaking down barriers. Even the kids playing outside seemed more inclusive, laughing and sharing toys without a second thought. At the station, Gary greeted his colleagues with a smile, joining them for the daily briefing. His superiors had taken note of his efforts, praising him for setting an example others could follow. While Gary knew he still had much to learn, he felt grateful for the opportunity to lead by action rather than words. That afternoon, as he responded to a call about a minor dispute between neighbors, Gary approached the situation with patience and empathy. He listened carefully to both sides, ensuring everyone felt heard and respected. By the end of the conversation, the tension had eased, replaced by mutual understanding. As he walked back to his patrol car, one of the neighbors called out, "Thanks, Officer Miller, we appreciate you." Those simple words meant more to Gary than any medal or accolade ever could. They were proof that his efforts were making a difference not just in his own life, but in the lives of others. When his shift ended, Gary returned home, exhausted but fulfilled. Sitting on the porch with Anna, he watched the sunset paint the sky in vibrant colors. For the first time in years, he felt truly content. The road ahead wouldn't always be smooth, but he was ready to face it with courage and determination. As darkness fell, enveloping the neighborhood in a peaceful quiet, Gary leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes. He thought about Marcus, about the Pentagon, and about the lessons he'd learned along the way. Most of all, he thought about the power of redemption, the idea that no matter how far someone strays, they can always find their way back if they're willing to try. And with that thought, Gary drifted off to sleep, dreaming of brighter days and endless possibilities.